Hey, good morning, everyone. I am Michael David Fox. I am Director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies here at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And we are delighted to welcome Robert Daly, Director of the Kissinger Institute. And to this Russia brief, I should start by saying that we are very grateful to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for its generous support of our programming, which includes Jill Dougherty's Russia brief. I'm going to briefly introduce Jill, who is known to, I think, many of you as someone who has had, I should say, a very distinguished career at CNN as foreign affairs correspondent. She was also White House correspondent for CNN and Moscow bureau chief. She is also an adjunct professor here at Ceres. Should also say, which I don't rarely do, that she's also a Georgetown graduate. So over to you, Jill.
Oh, thank you very much, Michael. I really am glad to do this. And Mr. Daly, welcome. And our audience, welcome to the Russia brief. You know, I was saying as we were getting ready here that I know a bit about China. I actually worked for CNN in Hong Kong for a while, a couple of years as the managing editor, but it's an area that I don't know as well. You know, I'm back in Europe, in Russia. So this will be an education for me too. And I'm really glad that we have the guest, Robert Daly. He has, I'd say, you know, distinguished academic credentials, no question, and think tank credentials, but he also has deep personal experience in China. He is an expert speaker of the language, and he also began working back in the 80s, in fact, in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And I even found out very briefly that he was one of the people who helped produce a Chinese language version of Sesame Street, which is, you know, another credential that I really wasn't aware of. But really welcome. And I do want to, not to make this not as serious as it should be, but I just wanted to point out that I have taken down and put up here my matryoshki that are Chinese. So I have Mao here and I have Hu Jintao there. I don't have the current leadership of Mr. Xi, but maybe, you know, we'll get back and get that and we'll be all set. But anyway, welcome, Robert. Maybe we can call you Robert, and really glad you're here.
Very good to be with you. Thanks, Jill. Thank you, Michael, as well.
Okay, so I would say, you know, the timing that we have right now is excellent because Vladimir Putin just this week, a day ago, practically, traveled to Beijing for 2 days of meetings at an event marking the 10th anniversary of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And for Putin, of course, it was a rare trip outside of Russia because, as we all know, he was indicted by the International Criminal Court for human rights violations in Ukraine. And so he doesn't make a lot of international trips. But China is very important. It's crucial for Putin. So, Robert, I wanted to begin with this vaunted phrase, you know, the no limits partnership. That is the way they actually technically have described it, although I don't seem to think that I saw that expression during this meeting in Beijing. But that said, a partnership is not an alliance. So could we get into this relationship? How would you define it? What's the nature of it? And maybe even, you know, what does one party want from the other?
You know, since Xi Jinping used that phrase, a partnership with no limits, he has at every single opportunity, most recently, as you note, this week, doubled down on support for Putin and Russia and for the invasion of Ukraine. That said, I think if he could go back there to the eve of the Beijing Winter Olympics and not use that phrase, he probably would. It hasn't helped him even within China itself. It's something that people have been very confused by. This is a very difficult relationship historically. China and Russia are not natural allies. As you know, in the Cold War, after their break, they actually fought in the north along the rivers. 150 people were killed. They have had historical territorial disputes, which are still referred to by the Chinese side. But despite all of that, despite profound distrust, they really have come together in what I think of as a kind of entente, not yet an alliance in the technical sense. And they've done that for very strong reasons, reasons which I think trump all of the many kinds of historical distrust in and disinterest in each other that we've seen. And that is that both of these countries, before the invasion of Ukraine, were wholly united in their desire not to have their environment shaped and their decisions shaped by the United States. And they were thoroughly sick of having their countries defined, including defined morally, before the world by what they saw as a Western-dominated media. And so again, prior to the war, that was already a fairly strong form of glue between the two of them. But now there's something else, which I think gives it even stronger staying power, and that is both Putin and Xi see the United States not only as a chronic annoyance, but now as an existential threat. You could talk about Putin's view, but for Xi Jinping and the rest of the Communist Party, they believe, no matter what the United States says, that our policy toward China is containment, regime change, and support for the independence of Taiwan. From their point of view, believing what they believe, having done what they've done, that really does constitute an existential threat, and it's not an unreasonable view. And so they now have that in common as well. Originally, it was something like annoyance or beyond, but now it's a much stronger bond that has them wanting to work together to defend themselves, but to also try to build up what is sometimes called a new alternate order against that of the United States. So despite all of their distrust for each other, which hasn't gone away entirely, that's a strong motivator.
You know, that's really a very interesting explanation of the relationship. And I just wanted to pick up from that on this idea that Putin has been talking about a lot. It's really kind of bringing back to life an old Soviet trope, but it is reaching out to the developing world, to the global South. And essentially what Putin says, and I'd be interested in what she exactly says and whether this is working, but essentially Putin says, you know, the West, the elites in the West want to run the world, and they really despise you in the developing world, and they want to hog all the resources in the world, including food. And we are on your side. We are, you know, out there for the developing world. Remember what we did during revolutionary periods during the Cold War, when they did help developing countries. So this, I think it is, it's hard to say whether it's working, but the material that I've seen and some of the research appears to say that it is working, that does have resonance. And some of those countries remember the old days back in the Soviet Union. So Robert, if you could walk us through China, how does China picture this? And is it working for them?
I think overall it is working for China, at least increasingly so. China comes at it in a way that is parallel to Russia historically, but somewhat different, in part because of the Sino-Soviet split. But it really goes back to the Bandung Conference in the mid-50s and China's determination to be seen as, and in some ways to actually be, a leader and a provider of public goods to what was then called the Third World, what we now somewhat uncomfortably call the Global South. Nobody really seems to be happy with that term, but no one has come up with a viable alternative. China never abandoned that position, and that position always included very strong support for the Palestinian cause, for the peace, independence, and development of Palestine, and for the two-state solution. So when China now says we've been consistent in advocating for that, that's true, although they've also developed better relations with Israel. That desire, as a member of a non-aligned third world movement going back to the 50s and 60s, has now been taken up a notch by China's desire to be a global superpower in the modern sense, not merely in the more defensive put upon mode of the 1950s, but a desire on China's part to exercise real leadership. And one of the places that they've had some luck with this, it mirrors, it echoes what you described as Putin's position, but it has a slightly more positive spin. If you look at China's documents, what they call the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, these things are paper thin. There's nothing about process, nothing about rules. It's just a series of blandishments and cliches, peace is good, this kind of thing. So it's easy to mock, but behind that is a very compelling idea, which is that Xi Jinping has put forward that the very reason for a world order is development. That's a different idea, and it's a variation on the Western idea, which says that a world order is to set up what is essentially a legalistic framework, which does a number of things, including providing for peace and development. But Xi has put development front and center. And that is extremely appealing throughout the global South. Doesn't mean that they're running fully into a Chinese-Russian embrace. It doesn't mean they have no interest in the United States and what its allies are providing. But that development first, that's a good banner.
That's also fascinating because, you're right. I don't think that Putin can offer that. There's, they have done, I noticed they're sending a bit of food aid, they say, to the Palestinians, but essentially I would argue, Moscow is a more negative diplomatic power, breaking down the old structures that the United States put in place after World War II. But we can go on with this, but it's really interesting. I should remind the audience that we're very eager to get your questions. So be thinking about those. We're going to talk for another, roughly 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And you put those in to the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. So again, Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So, you mentioned, Robert, a little bit there, the Middle East and what's going on with Hamas vis-a-vis Israel. And now we have two wars. So we have the Middle East and we have Ukraine. If it were a few weeks ago, we'd begin with Ukraine, and we will get into that. But let's talk about the Middle East for a second. I think it's notable that neither country outright condemned Hamas's attack on Israel, and they're both calling for a ceasefire. Putin, right from the get-go, right after the attack by Hamas, blamed a lot of it on the United States, saying the United States won't allow Russia to be a full partner in the Mideast peace process. And then China, as you mentioned, historically on the side of the Palestinians, but then moving out and increasing its diplomacy in the region. So I guess my question would be, are the two countries aligned in where we go from now with this war, which could spin out of control? How do you see that?
They do seem to be fairly strongly aligned, both in the more positive prescriptions for a ceasefire, for development, for seeking, trying to end the cycle of violence. They're not risking anything to get there. These are sort of easy pronouncements to make, but I don't think they're insincere for their shallowness. I think that probably does reflect what they would like to see. And then they're also very united in the decision to put the United States in the foreground. So that in China, it's not just that they haven't condemned Hamas. Their party-run media doesn't mention Hamas. They haven't mentioned terrorism. There's no reporting on what Hamas did on October 7th. Their reporting begins with clips, which you'll appreciate from your background, of American aircraft carriers steaming through the Mediterranean, creating the sense that this was all something that the United States began and provoked and is now arming, which is exactly the Chinese view about Ukraine as well. That it's really the United States pushing NATO further east. It's that same narrative. So there doesn't seem to be too much daylight between them. And you mentioned that Putin takes a far more negative view. That works well for Xi Jinping. He's the big brother in this relationship. And he's delighted to outsource most of the snark and the coarseness and the direct attacks to Putin. All of that language warms the cockles of their heart, but he also gets to stand above it in a more statesmanlike way and say, peace is good, development is good. So I think that both wars are actually bringing these countries even closer together. And in some ways, as you mentioned in your earlier remarks, are helping their outreach to the global South. And both countries, including China, we're seeing in the Middle East, as with Ukraine, propaganda that says, look at America, look at Europe and the West, paying all of this attention to these conflicts while they ignore yours in, for example, Africa. So I think that this, war is bringing them closer together.
Could we just drill down a little bit more on Ukraine? I guess I as a person looking at more the Russia side, but looking at what China's doing, it feels nuanced. It feels very careful. There's obviously, China has a relationship with the West, an important relationship, which it cannot damage either. So could you just give us a brief understanding of how Xi Jinping is maneuvering and positioning himself on Ukraine?
Well, the invasion of Ukraine has already hurt China greatly with the West, and particularly in Europe. China had concluded, and Europe were close to concluding, something called a Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, the CAI, midway through COVID, and they were eager to do that, to get a real free trade agreement. That was then put on ice after China put sanctions on members of the European Parliament. But there's still a lot of interest in reviving it. That interest, which China was going to try to use to drive a wedge between America and Europe, ended with China's support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So China has lost out in Europe, which has increasingly come toward American-style skepticism. And so they're not trying to make that balance. They would like to revive it if they can. But this comes back to what I mentioned of China's truly seeing the United States as an existential threat. It therefore needs a strong partner, and that partner has to be Russia. They need a strong Russia under a strong Putin. And so, as you said, China has been somewhat nuanced. They've helped Russia in many ways by buying fuel, by selling things like drones and parts and semiconductors. But they haven't provided large amounts of lethal aid, we think, yet. But they would if they thought that Putin would fall and fail. If China thought that Russia was going to be substantially weakened as a Chinese partner vis-a-vis the United States, I believe then they would provide lethal aid. It's not there yet. If it's a long stalemate, China can live with that. They'll maintain strong support for Russia in everything but arms, but they've already factored in the costs vis-a-vis Europe and vis-a-vis the United States, and they continue to have some confidence that the size and the lure of their market will prevail over time. They see us as hypocrites who profess high-sounding principles, but are really about power and profit. And so there's a sense that they can wait it out and that we'll come back. And they see this, for example, with electronic vehicles, especially for their batteries. If we need them, we're going to go there.
We've talked about the Middle East. We've talked about Europe, Ukraine. Could we switch focus to Asia itself? The region obviously is China's backyard, but Russia's an Asian, player. Do they look at regional relationships and in that region in the same way, or it appears that there's a bit of competition, or at least they don't see eye to eye on everything in Asia?
No, that's true. This too is a dynamic factor. China and Russia are conducting more joint military exercises, naval exercises in the region, particularly in the north and near Japan. China still has never sanctioned the annexation of Crimea. Russia has never said that it supports China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. And most annoyingly, from China's point of view, Russia continues to be the primary source of arms sales to Vietnam and India. So one question going forward is going to be, will China, again, with very much the upper hand in this relationship? Russia it's not quite a dependency, but in some ways it's heading in that department. Will one of China's demands, be the cessation of Russian arms sales to India and Vietnam? That's one to keep an eye on. But you're quite right that this is a region in which they have politely agreed to disagree. That may be shifting.
Mm-hmm. I'll just ask one other question, and then I want to we've already got quite a few questions in Q&A, and I want Michael to be able to chime in here with his own questions, but just a very quick, immediate thing. Victor Cha, who's at Georgetown University, has a really excellent podcast that I was just on. And he was talking about a new report about North Korea providing weapons to Russia for Ukraine. And traditionally, and vice versa, Russia giving high tech potentially to North Korea. So the question is, China has usually been looked upon as perhaps, an influential voice that would kind of calm down North Korea. What about in this case? I mean, if you've got arms trade going on between the two countries, what is China doing, if anything, about that?
Well, China, I think that its influence over North Korea has been somewhat exaggerated in the United States. China is usually fairly ticked off and embarrassed by North Korea. They can't control it wholly. And this has been true for a long time. It's infuriating to China, for example, that North Korea has never recognized China's essential contribution during the Korean War, basically rescuing the country, never acknowledged. And there are other ways, too, in which China can't really control Pyongyang. Of course, China also uses that claim. Nothing I can do, boys. I'd stop them if I could, but I just can't do it. When in fact they're pleased with the way that North Korea is a thorn in the side of the West. And I can't see any reason that China would dislike North Korean weapons sales to Russia. If it strengthens Russia in the field and therefore strengthens Russia as a partner for China, China is for it, and they haven't complained. We, at least in the public sphere, have given them a pass on that. I haven't seen many demands from the United States that China interfere, with this or prevent these weapon sales. So I think we can assume that China approves of those weapon sales. This serves China's interests. Better North Korea than China itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think Michael, would you like to get into the conversation here?
Thanks for remembering me, Jill. And Robert, this has been really informative and fascinating so far. For me as a historian, what's really interesting is how this, in the last, perspective of the last 100 years, the relationship of the big brother and little brother has been, reversed. Yeah. And what you said about putting development front and center, this was the attraction of the Soviet model and Soviet cultural diplomacy, a shortcut to modernity for much of the used to be called the third world. I have actually sort of two questions. The first is what you said about the perception of an existential threat. This rings true to me very much for Putin's Russia. I'm wondering, though, on the Chinese side, how much pluralism there may be beneath the monolithic facade. And we know that that different groups jockeying around may have different views of this. So that would be of great interest to discuss, the Russia a little more deeply, because you also mentioned that, there was some justification to seeing that view. Secondly, this is from my own parochial point of view, but my perception of Russian studies in China is that the expertise in academia, at least, has been curtailed, and some of the exchanges and interests over the last 3 years have fallen away, and that's interesting because it suggests that the relationship is not being studied as deeply on the Chinese side. So I was just wondering if you had anything to say about that.
Well, you're right to point out that China is not monolithic. I think that you both know my former colleague, Matthew Rajansky, who headed the Kennan Institute for a while at the Wilson Center. And he and I started traveling together in the region, I think around 2015. And he used to say, that the United States has a Putin policy where it needs a Russia policy. And we're now in danger of having a Xi Jinping policy where we really need a China policy of focusing too much on Xi, and that tends to be more of an index of our own hopes and fears than it is a reflection of what's actually going on in China. So yes, there are different strands within China, and the modernist, internationalist, liberal strand is one of them. And we saw this somewhat with Deng Xiaoping's successors. It was in the ascendancy, and China, from 1978 until the emergence of Xi Jinping in 2012, was liberalizing, even at the level of personal freedom. You didn't have political freedom or full freedom of expression, but it was getting better. That liberal strand was making gains. You hear nothing from it now. So we know that it must still be there. I mean, we can read the work of intellectuals who get out. We know that it's there. We know, because we study the history of the Communist Party, that there are always factions and infighting and dissatisfaction, but we can't perceive them the way that we used to. We know that because of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption drive, his attacks on businesses, that he's made a lot of enemies within the party itself and within the PLA. But we can't really see the fissures. We can only talk about why they must be there in theory. So yes, we do need to keep an eye on China in all of its complexity, its totality, but that's getting tougher to do. Xi has taken China from being a developmental state to being a highly ideological security state. He has gone from softening authoritarianism to techno-totalitarianism. So our ability to read it has gone down. Now, my understanding regarding Chinese Russia studies, obviously, during the period of tutelage, really from 1921 until 1960, there was a lot of Russia studies in China, and many Chinese, including many leaders, spent a lot of time in Moscow. Then, with the opening to the United States, it all became English and the Anglophone world. English studies are said to be declining now in China, and there's renewed interest in Russian studies. We'll see how deeply that goes. The Chinese people seem to genuinely like Putin as a strongman. But civilizationally, China has disdain for Russia. It's disdain. It's not really attractive to them. And then just sort of a last observation, but something that you reminded me of. I was in Moscow last in 2019 at the Primakov readings, and it was right after Xi and Putin had met in St. Petersburg and talked about their deep strategic relationship. And I was walking down the Arbat, and I didn't see a Chinese character on front of a single store. And I went into a little drugstore, and it was Harry Potter books in Russian and Rick and Morty posters on the wall and Simpsons tapes. Both of these countries, despite what Jill and I were talking about, real reasons to draw more closely together. In fact, both of them really look to the West more for things like institutional models in terms of many of their aspirations. They don't really look to each other for the solutions to problems other than short-term problems in Ukraine, and for someone to stand shoulder to shoulder with vis-a-vis the United States. But other than that, it still seems to be pretty shallow in both directions.
We do have some great questions by a number of colleagues who know what they're talking about. So I think we'll go to the Q&A. And I'd like to begin with one from Emily Matson, who is another expert in China. Thanks for the great dialogue. I wanted to follow up about Robert Daly's comment on the current Sino-Russian relationship, in which China is acting as the big brother. This turns the historical Sino-Soviet relationship, in which the USSR was the big brother, on its head. Is there any historical memory about this in Russia today? Does it play into Russian propaganda at all, or even potentially into Russian resentment of China's rise? What would you say, Robert?
Well, it's a great question, Emily. Some of that on the Russian side, Jill, I would put to you. I don't have any street cred in Russia, and it's very hard for me to know what people there are thinking. But as Emily will know, there have been a number of turns of the wheel. The first one you hear about this more now, oddly, in Russia, is Genghis Khan, the Golden Hordes in the 12th century, and you hear that now referred to by Russians as part of a Russian inheritance, which is now positive, rather than as part of the Yellow Horde's racism that you still find, including in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Moscow. You then had, in 1689, at the height of the Qing dynasty, that was the apex of China's northern expansion, right up to the shores of Lake Baikal, southern Lake Baikal, well into what is now Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and up the Pacific coast, when the Qing dynasty was far stronger than Russia itself. But 170 years later, when the Qing dynasty was failing, 1858, it flipped. And in the Treaty of Argun, what China calls one of the unequal treaties, Russia took a lot of that land back, pushed the border south. This is when it got Vladivostok. And there's writing in China now, which harkens back to that full extent of the Qing dynasty, which says, well, Vladivostok, which they call the Cliffs of Sea Cucumber, should really be ours, as is Baikal. For that matter, Okinawa and the Ryukyus should all. So you hear some of this. China refers back to this history and to the unequal treaties. I don't think that China is really going to revisit its borders. It's actually happy to have solved that problem, and it can get what it needs, hydrocarbons and food, from the Russian Far East through commercial means. But yes, there's knowledge clearly on both sides about all of the back and forth, because it was a major source of propaganda. Mao Zedong had Chinese digging and building underground cities because he believed that Russia might use nuclear weapons. So that history goes pretty deep, and I think is not forgotten. But again, it's the sense of existential threat, unremitting attacks culturally, in media terms, economically, militarily from the West, that has them put all of that at the back of the drawer for now. That's my sense, primarily from the China side. I'd love to hear your views on the Russia side.
Well, I think it's difficult. I was just recalling a trip that I had maybe 4 years ago, and I was paying for it myself. So I was staying in a cheap hotel, not that cheap, but it was across from the foreign ministry. And everyone in my hotel was Chinese. The signs were in Chinese, Chinese credit cards were accepted. And it was really striking to me. There were a lot of tourists right now in Moscow and big cities. And that I think is one of the, foci right now for Russia, that they're getting a lot of tourism from Chinese who have the money to travel. And that's important. I do think also, when Ukraine, let's say go back to 2014, and from then to now, the Russians have perceived the Chinese as their insurance policy for problems that they were having from sanctions. These, exactly as an example, would be credit cards that didn't work. Russian credit cards no longer working. Chinese credit cards were looked at as a way for Russia to survive. So I think there is some of that, let's say, transactional approach to the relationship. Well, they help us. Well, they come and they spend our money. I do still see some underlying racism there. And also, I think, kind of, concerned that the Chinese are outstripping Russia. I was on a trip a while ago to the Far East, to Blagoveshchensk, that town that's right on the border, like across the river from China.
Across the river from Heihe. It's
exactly.
Yes, yeah.
And it's like two different worlds, because in Russia, it looked like Tolstoy land. looked like the 1800s and kind of sleepy. And across the river, literally like across the Potomac, you have China, glass buildings, people running around, working, etc. And one of the men who was there, a businessman I talked to, said, when I need people to work, I hire Chinese. So this is, just kind of random.
No, it's important. Everything, that you say in my experience is also true. My question is, how does that really sit in the Russian gut? There's clearly thanks for this, but it's demeaning, right? It's not really where great Russia wants to be.
Well, if I might add just one point,
Sure.
that the Russian relationship ranges from some legacies of Russian Orientology, which had very sophisticated understandings of Chinese language and culture, but in intelligentsia circles, scholarly circles, to the kind of overt racism and disdain, I think, is well matched on the Russian side but they're on a mass scale, I would say, as you mentioned in the case of China, the kind of the romance, the love-hate relationship is with the West, right? And there's not very much sort of on a large scale appreciation for China. And I think a lot of the apprehensions and disdain on the Russian side relate to that.
Well, I want to get back to the questions because there really are a lot. We'll go to Jan Kalicki, who asks a great question. To what extent are the anti-US themes of Xi and Putin undermined by their warlike actions in Ukraine and Taiwan/South China Sea? Robert?
Well, I guess the question is undermined where, right? Obviously, there's a great deal of ongoing criticism of China vis-a-vis Taiwan and the invasion of Ukraine among developed democracies. But there's no real evidence that is undermining the position of China and Russia in, again, this term, the global South. It hasn't kept people from going to the BRI meeting. It hasn't prevented South Africa, for example, from carrying out joint military exercise with China and Russia. And so we're seeing it would be, some people write as if this is a bifurcation of the world. That's highly exaggerated. But a division of the countries that are going to be driven by concern for the invasion of Ukraine and the threats of Taiwan, and the countries that think that that's a secondary or a tertiary matter. And that's a long list of countries. It's a majority of votes within the United Nations. So that China and Russia, so far it appears, have found a way to make it work for them and to, again, slowly begin to set up, they're not there yet, something like alternate global systems that include alternate Huawei-based telecom systems, ultimate payment systems, which can get you around SWIFT and sanctions that way, increased use of the RMB. And this is working for them in the Middle East, in much of Africa, in a good part of Latin America, in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia. And so we sit on the other side with, moral certainty, which doesn't have a lot of purchase outside of, again, the developed democracies. And so it's, I think, surprising and should be a warning for us that they've had so much success here. And that's, to a considerable degree, not because they're really providing global goods or solutions or clear answers, but because we continue to neglect all of these parts of the world. And I worry here about this, return of great power competition narrative as a frame for American diplomacy, because it gives us permission once again to ignore all the parts of the world that we always ignore, where China and Russia are making gains. And so we've got to, I'd say, keep our moral certainty about the meaning of what Hamas and Russia have done, but we've also got to look at the long-term global picture and ask where we want to be, 10, 20, 30 years down the road.
Yeah. Nigel Lee actually is I'm almost sorry I didn't ask it before you said that, because he says, is Washington doing itself a disservice by dismissing the vapidity of the idealistic statements espoused in the Global Development and Security Initiative? If so, how should Washington respond both in its renewal of its global vision and engaging with the likes of Russia and China in this ideological struggle? It's a little different take.
Great question, because vapidity runs throughout all of these documents. And again, they're so easy to laugh off because they just put forward, virtuous statements that nobody can disagree with. My mother used to call such speech, "Goodness is better than badness because it's nicer." And that's what these documents sound like. But yes, per the question, you do laugh it off at your expense, because what China does is it puts forth vague, unobjectionable statements. And it says, would you like to endorse or sign on to the BRI, or would you sign on to the Global Development Initiative? Well, what does sign on mean? What does endorse mean? Don't worry about that. We'll figure that out later. But won't you endorse this? There's nothing not to endorse, right? And so the countries of Central Asia, which I visited this spring, and others, endorse, because China takes names. And if you don't endorse, you're worried about where that may go. And it's easy to sign on to these vapid statements because they don't obligate you to anything. The danger for a lot of these countries is that China then puts meat on bones. And when it's ready to really stand up a completed, or what is seen as a completed structure for an alternate order, countries that didn't intend to will find themselves viewed by the United States as now standing with China and Russia on the other side of a chasm. Whereas piece by piece, vapidity by vapidity, it was the better part of wisdom to sign on, because who does it hurt? And so, yes, we have to pay very close attention to this. In terms of what should we do, frankly, I think we should take a piece out of Xi Jinping's book. He begins all of his speeches by saying the world is changing very fast, and we need to change with it. We need to study these changes. You don't hear that in American political discourse. We need to put aside this defensive crouch that says, join us in defending the global rules-based order. Instead of saying that, why can't we be open-handed and issue an invitation to the world to look at the global order, to ask how we can improve it for everybody in a way that is transparent and democratic, and that allows for disagreement? Why do we, we're in a defensive crouch about order, and we need to be issuing an invitation to everybody, frankly, including Russia and China, to come in and say, well, what do you want? What do you need in the form of a rule? And that's where I think our diplomacy should be based, but it's not. We're hunkering down and asking people to defend something that they don't believe in, that only partially exists anyway, that has always been evolving and full of holes and contested. And I think that we're missing a real trick in not doing that.
Okay. There's a question from Ray Yu, and I think you mentioned Vladivostok and some of the history of that, the Far East of Russia. And his question is, with China's recent acquired access to Vladivostok, first, do you think China will press Russia on more concessions in Russia's Far East without reclaiming outer Manchuria? And second, do you think China will expand the Arctic trade route, and would Europeans be receptive to a shorter trade route with China? It's kind of a big picture question, and then a very specific one about trade routes, but right. Interesting, intriguing question.
So in the Russian Far East, I think that China knows that any real claims would be needlessly provocative, because it can pay for everything it needs, which is far cheaper, and that's hydrocarbons. And then as global warming proceeds, Siberia, like Canada, is one of the great beneficiaries as more and more land becomes tillable. And so China will have a new source of proteins, but it can simply buy those. And so it does have an eye, out for those opportunities, but I don't think it is going to involve anything like renegotiating the borders. China just simply doesn't have to do that. In the Arctic, this I think is probably also going to be a major ask of China to Russia, is enhanced access not only to trade routes, but to oil and gas exploration, to fisheries. As that becomes possible, China has a very steady eye on the Arctic in all of these regions. Europe continues, like the United States, to import large amounts of goods from China, despite their concerns. And the less they can pay for those, the better. So if it results in lower prices for Europeans because China is making extensive use of the Arctic trade route, then I don't think that they would object to that. Now, the members of the Arctic Council, most of whom are European, are extremely skeptical about China's involvement, about its claim to be a near Arctic nation. And so they are, if anything, I think they're stiffening their spines against this. But I believe that, China, I expect, will ask Russia for more and more access and permission and cooperative ventures. And of course, China has the capacity to help Russia build out its infrastructure further on the Arctic coast. And so China can be patient. They're not in a bad position vis-a-vis the Arctic.
There's a question from Harley Balzer. It's a pretty specific question, and it kind of gets us back to the beginning of our conversation. He's saying, is this still a no limits partnership? And then he goes on, and I'll read part of it at least, describing Li Yucheng, Chinese deputy foreign minister, who coined the phrase no limits partnership, he says, when Putin was in Beijing in 2022. He was dismissed after the February 24th invasion of Ukraine, moved to TV and radio administration, and it took place one day after Antony Blinken met with Yang Yiqi in Brussels. Li was the only deputy minister who was a Central Committee member. He now must retire. Now, that's an interesting tale in and of itself, but I'm struck. This reminds me so much of Kremlinology, who's standing on Lenin's tomb and who was airbrushed out of a picture. But we really, I guess, are at that stage. This is more a China question, not vis-a-vis Russia, but are we still at that stage where the inner workings of these relationships are very opaque and you have this intriguing incident? So
China, the top echelons of the Communist Party remain a black box, and it's a blacker box than it's ever been. Yu Licheng, who was thought to perhaps be a foreign minister in waiting, who was somebody very publicly who clearly hadn't seen the invasion coming, was shunted aside. But more recently, and probably more importantly, was the Chinese foreign minister Qin Gang, who was disappeared and then fired from that post. He was a Xi Jinping protege, both as ambassador to the United States and then as foreign minister. He hadn't been in that position long. We then had the heads of China's rocket force, both let go, no reasons given. And then China's Minister of Defense, again, a Xi appointee fairly recently. There appears to be very little in the way of vetting of these folks. It's embarrassing for China, but we don't know what's really going on. I said that in our study of the Communist Party, we'd always known there were factions. And they used to be partly public. When Deng Xiaoping was liberalizing the economy, we knew who the economic conservatives in the Politburo were who were arguing with Deng. This was partially public and licit. So we had some view, some vision into that. Now we have none under Xi Jinping. We think we know who his closest advisors are, but we don't really know what the nature of those conversations is. We don't know what information and feedback actually reaches Xi Jinping. We know less than we have ever known at a vital point. And so we tend to assume that it's all Xi Jinping, and we tend to assume the worst. And there's plenty of evidence to support that, but it gives us a somewhat simplistic narrative about China.
Yeah, it has certain echoes, I think, for Vladimir Putin, whose coterie of advisors, et cetera, really has narrowed, and Michael knows this so well, especially since he's an expert in the Soviet period, Cold War history, that right now you almost could argue that, less about what Putin is thinking than ever, because it is such a closed little environment. I have it. Michael, did you want to weigh in on that, or we? Okay. I want to go to another question here, Nigel Lee, and we touched on it, but I think it is significant. It's about education. There's been an increase in China-Russia student exchanges. Western countries will have succeeding generations of future leaders without contact with Russia. the United States will. What are the consequences of this, and how could future Sino-Russia experts in the West make up for it?
Well, we do. I know more about the China side here, where demand for Chinese language instruction at almost every level has gone down. Interest in China studies has gone down from students, and interest in going to China has also gone down. There's a serious decline just when we
in
are
the U.S.
in the U.S.
In the U.S.
all down, and this really began about before Xi Jinping. It's really about 2008 to 2010 when there were all these reports about how horrible the Chinese air was. It began with that, and it has only because of COVID, and now simply because of a essentially new sort of Cold War antagonism between the United States and China. China's has taken hostages. They've issued export bans. They have rewritten their counter-espionage law, which really tells the Chinese people to view all foreigners in China and all Chinese who interact with them as spies until proven otherwise. We're just not getting the back and forth, and so I'm very concerned about American scholarship of China. In fact, I'm involved in a group that will meet up in the Hudson River Valley the weekend after this one, a long-term project funded by Luce to look at this, to look at China studies and how we understand China from the academy, but also from think tanks and from media. And I suspect we'll find that there are no good answers. And there's also not much funding on the American side. We tend to undervalue this. And Professor Fox will know the notion of area studies as a legitimate academic discipline died decades ago, right? The disciplines have chopped everything up into sociology and anthropology and economics and political science and whatever it may be. And so nobody gets a broad cultural, sinological background anymore. Maybe you'll tell me that at Georgetown, it just ain't so. I hope that's right. But there's a problem here. And then every time the American government, Congress, rediscovers this problem and wants to give money to language study, they give it all to the Department of Defense. And it doesn't actually come into the universities. So this is something that we're very bad at, and I don't see any positive signs around the corner, frankly.
Yeah, we have a few more minutes. Let's see, 53. So, 7 more minutes or so. Jeremy Cohen asked an interesting question. So we're now moving into Central Asia. While in the U.S., we often view Central Asia as an arena for Russia-China competition, to what degree is this actually the case? Does China have aspirations beyond resource access that would compete with Russian political military primacy?
So I was in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan earlier this year for about 2 weeks, doing a deep dive on exactly this. The way the Central Asians themselves speak about it is they say we have a multi-vector diplomacy. Russia, obviously, for security, China for economics, and increasingly now for security, especially vis-a-vis Russia. But they also speak of looking to Europe, to Iran, to the Middle East, and to some degree to the United States, although the United States isn't very active in the region. A lot of these countries have a more important relationship with Chevron than they do with the United States itself. It's a place that we don't pay enough attention to. But yes, they very much feel the pull from China, and that is their biggest concern, but in some ways it's their biggest opportunity. They want it to balance against Russia. They need the investment. They need the markets. They would like to be able to balance those off each other, but they're also stuck. And the question I think they have to ask themselves is, which do they fear more, losing Chinese largesse or becoming client states of China? They fear both of those things. And that Soviet sort of anti-Chinese yellow hordes racism is alive and well in Central Asia. The fear of being overrun, of being bought out. One of the biggest demonstrations in Kazakhstan in the past decade came about when it was proposed that a lot of land, agricultural land, be leased to China. So they're torn, but we are not there for them. It's simply a place that is barely on the map for us, especially since we pulled out of Afghanistan. And you know very well, culturally, we just tend to lump all the countries that end with "stand" together. You first lump them together, and then you ignore the lump, right? And that's still largely where we are. And so they are going to get resources where those resources are available.
You know, we have 4 minutes, and I'm going to ask you a question that's actually pretty broad, but maybe you can, you know, complete it in 4 minutes. So
Okay.
I was talking with Georgetown students just yesterday, and one of them asked this question. So I'm going to ask you, because I almost fell out of my seat when he did it in depression about the situation in the world. So he said, okay, we've got this war in the Middle East, spinning out of control. We have Ukraine. And wouldn't, he asked, this be a good time for China to attack Taiwan? So now, I mean, it's, you know, as we say in Russian, вызывающий вопрос, but, you know, it's kind of a, I don't know, you know, how do we say?
A leading question.
Yeah, a leading question. Okay, so how would you answer that?
Well, China, you know, for China, Taiwan, the question of Taiwan it's an unfinished civil war, full stop, and therefore it's solely, in Beijing's point of view, a domestic issue that none of us have any business looking at. You've seen two narratives about China over the past roughly 8 years. The dominant narrative has been that China is inexorably rising, and that it is our major long-term security challenge and its strategic challenge. I think that those things are both true. It's our greatest geopolitical challenge. And so the notion was that therefore we need to arm up because China's coming. Well, now over the past few years, there's been a secondary narrative, which is that we've actually seen peak China, that China is already slowing down. It may be plateauing, it may actually be declining. And the theory goes that, you know, China had been seeing, relative to Taiwan, power differentials shrinking in China's favor, and now it sees them widening in China's detriment, and therefore China's more likely to move sooner while the power differentials are as narrow as possible. And therefore, again, the moral of the story is arm up. Narrative one, arm up. Narrative two, the opposite, arm up. Who do you think's driving this narrative? Right? I actually disagree. I mean, I could be proven wrong this evening, right? China could move on Taiwan this evening. But I tend to think not, because I don't think that China looks primarily at those long-term power differentials. They look at the costs and benefits to moving on Taiwan for the Chinese Communist Party year to year. And because they're in their deepest economic crisis since 1978 and are likely to remain there for a bit, I think we've probably exaggerated. We're a little bit triumphalist about the weaknesses in China's economy. We'll see. But because they're weaker economically, actually the cost for the Communist Party of moving against Taiwan and failing or not succeeding quickly, the costs of that are higher than ever because they're weaker because of the economy. And so I think that their instinct will be to still counter our moves vis-a-vis Taiwan. They're still threatening Taiwan in air and sea and through gray zone tactics. But I think their tendency is going to be to want to hunker down and stabilize things at home. And that means that we can, through deterrence, but also through diplomacy and working with allies, continue to convince them year to year to kick the can one more time and say, this is not yet our moment on Taiwan. I think that is still within our ken, and I think that should be the focus of our policy.
Yeah. Well, okay, I feel better.
Well, don't I say this is a guess, and you know, nobody knows anything. They're always asking me at the Wilson Center to do a strategic plan. You know, nobody foresaw, you know, the advent of Donald Trump or COVID or the invasion of Ukraine or now what's happening in the Middle East. You know, what is the point of strategic planning, right? Everything's so contingent. So I'm not claiming this is true. No crystal ball. That's just my best guess.
Let me just say that you can plan for the future of area studies, which are alive and well, although facing a lot of challenges here at the School of Foreign Service. So I'd love to engage you more about that. One of our long-standing projects is to have a conference on kind of reinventing area studies.
Well, and you've got just wonderful people in China studies. All different aspects of China studies. I'd be delighted to speak with them, but there's nothing that I know that Kristen Looney or Evan Medeiros or Dennis Wilder don't know.
Well, this is great. I hope that will be fruitful. And I really want to thank everybody involved. We had some great questions from our audience out there. Wanted to thank Michael David Fox for introducing all of this, and Robert Daly, really a fascinating conversation. I mean, I really learned a lot, and I'm very grateful. I hope our faithful audience will come back for our next discussion, which should be about a month from now. And sincere thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which makes all of this possible, and the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.